Do you like traveling? If so, has anything bad ever happened to you during a trip? That is what we'll be talking about in today's video. Now, if you've seen me talk before, it should not come as a shock when I say that I absolutely love traveling. In fact, it might be my single favorite thing in life. And it's something that my wife and I initially really bonded over when we first met. And so before I could go to Russia back in 2017, I needed a visa, which I didn't have yet. And so my first meetings with my wife were actually in just various countries around the former Soviet Union. And sometimes she could enter without a visa, and sometimes she couldn't. And so as a result, I spent part of the time just backpacking alone, just traveling around different countries, kind of like that YouTuber Bald and Bankrupt. So once I finally got my Russian visa to come and visit her, I, of course, needed to go to the airport and fly to Moscow. And that is where our story begins. And so I was in one of these former Soviet countries in a Russian-speaking area, preparing to fly to Moscow at 6 a.m. the next day. And the hostel I was sleeping at was very close to a taxi stand. It was just a short walk away, and I had previously seen taxis there basically 24/7. And so even though I didn't have Uber, I was confident that I could just walk there at night, show a prepared message on my phone, and easily get somebody to drive me to the airport. An important detail is that since I had been switching countries so often, I didn't have a local SIM card and was just relying on Wi-Fi whenever available. I also no longer had an American phone number, so international data wasn't an option even if I wanted it. At this time, I spoke zero Russian, maybe just spasiba, and that's it. So I was at a pretty large disadvantage. When I initially wanted to travel around some of these countries, I had sort of actually underestimated just how much the language would be a barrier, because English proficiency was just vastly lower than I realized, and I found myself in kind of unfavorable situations multiple times because of the language barrier. But anyway, so it is now the night or the very early morning that I need to leave for the airport. It's about 3 a.m. Again, the flight is at 6 a.m. And I put my plan into action. I check out of my hostel and walked to this taxi stand. And to my delight, it was full of drivers. And so I just picked a car at random, approached the driver, and showed him a prepared message on my phone that said, "I will pay you this much money, drive me to the airport." He looked at it, got out of the car, and summoned or conjured the other drivers. So several men walk over. They all begin speaking Russian to each other, with the initial driver pointing at me several times. And after this discussion, the initial driver motions for me to pay him, which I did. And then he pointed to another taxi and just said, "Go." So I walk over to this other car. I got in the back seat. And then somehow, even though we couldn't communicate verbally, we acknowledged this journey before leaving the taxi stand. So we take off, and I immediately noticed that the gas tank was completely on empty. The fuel gauge was so low, I couldn't imagine how we'd make it to the airport without stopping for gas. So I became concerned, but before I could say anything to him, he pulled over after a few minutes and picked up another passenger. But this passenger was apparently a friend of his, judging from their communication with each other. This new passenger was a youngish guy. I should have added, both of them were probably in their late 20s. And this new passenger gets into the front seat and immediately takes an interest in me. Using a translation app on his phone, he typed in Russian and showed me, "Why are you here?" And I replied, "I'm just backpacking around." And the two men then began talking to each other. And of course, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it was still making me feel very uncomfortable. And it became a little bit more uncomfortable when the passenger started making phone calls. And he spoke to one particular person for an extended period of time. And obviously, all of this was extremely weird, because why is this passenger being picked up at 3 a.m.? And obviously, he seemed to be expecting this driver to come pick him up, yet 10 minutes earlier, this driver was parked at a taxi stand with no clear destination. and now he's giving someone a ride going in the same direction. This didn't make sense. And the fuel gauge is completely empty. And so we're just driving around. The driver and the passenger are talking to each other. Occasionally he asks me a question. And we were driving through a very, very desolate area. There were a few streetlights, and the car begins to slow down. And so my first thought is that we had run out of gas. So the passenger gets out of the car and disappears behind one of these dilapidated buildings. All of the windows on the buildings around all had bars across them. It was an extremely rundown area. And so the passenger, he runs behind one of these abandoned or destroyed buildings. And I signaled to the driver that I needed his translation app. So he hands me his phone, and I typed, "What happened?" And his response really surprised me. He typed back, "Nothing. He is buying a cake." And so I thought, is this an error in translation? Is this code for something? Is this a joke? If I'd known where we were, or if I'd had access to data, I might have just run away from the car, just get out and run. And if I had known the emergency services number, in that moment when the driver gave me his phone, I might have dialed it and then just shouted like, "Help, help, help." But I didn't know the local number, and so I was stuck. While we were waiting for this passenger, a middle-aged man who appeared to be homeless and or mentally unstable, he approached the driver's door and he started banging feverishly on the window, shouting. The driver shouts back at him. Now, presumably this crazy guy was asking for a ride, but they yelled at each other for several minutes before the night man just wanders off. So everything about the situation was bizarre. Now, after about 10 minutes, I'm using rough estimates here because I don't actually fully remember, but about 10 minutes later, the passenger comes back into the car. He gets back in with nothing, no bag, certainly no cake. I don't know, maybe he had already eaten it. And these two men continue talking as we resumed driving. Again, I have no idea how the car is still running on gas. And we'd been driving for about an hour by this point, so perhaps the fuel gauge was broken. But we're now driving in a very, very rural area, and we're passing open fields that are only illuminated by the moon. And we're driving and driving, and I am getting that kind of sick feeling in my stomach as we continue driving. I realize we're not going in the direction of an airport. And we are driving and driving until we get to a small settlement that is just a series of shacks. It was just a street or a road that had a couple of shacks on each side of it, and that was this village or settlement. And I'm thinking, okay, is this where there are no witnesses, they know I'm an American traveling by myself, I was going to the airport, so they know I have my passport, or they probably assume I have cash. And I'm thinking, are they just going to put a bullet in the back of my head and take my stuff? I thought it was a 50-50 chance, right? Because if that was what was going to happen, this is exactly what the lead up would look like. This is how these stories begin, right? Everything I've just experienced would track with a true crime story. And so we're at this small settlement of shacks, and they're single story, very poorly built, and they have these just nooks and crannies in this siding on the walls that made them look homemade, which is why I remember them as being shacks. And the passenger then gets out of the car and he goes into one of these shacks. And to my relief or shock, the driver does back up, he turns around, and we drive however long until we get to the airport. Now, once we arrive at the airport, the driver then did demand more money, right? I tried explaining I'd already paid the other guy. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about, pay me." Maybe I could have just gotten out of the taxi and run, right? I don't think he's going to follow me. But regardless, I decided to pay him because the fact is, being on the receiving end of kind of a dumb, lowbrow scam, vastly better than being, killed in a rural area. So I arrived at the airport. I was just relieved to be done with it. Now, if you do need a taxi or you need a ride in a foreign country, obviously always know the emergency services number. have data if possible, and only order taxis through ride sharing apps. Of course, you can still be scammed, but if you don't use a ride sharing app and do what I did, you approach somebody, try to negotiate. Best case scenario, you're going to be charged 2 or 3 times the regular, the market rate. And worst case scenario, you'll be on the receiving end of a much more serious crime. So traveling is fun. Know your emergency numbers and always have data if possible. And I guess if you can travel with a local, even better, but don't do what I did. Thank you for watching until the very end. Make sure to like and subscribe.